Hey everyone, happy Wednesday. I'm Lauren McDonald, Chief Analyst at Paren. Welcome to today's pricing webinar. This is the second in our series of webinars, so we're really excited to kick off this series. Today's topic is a complex one, which is why we have a really long and complicated title to reflect that. Trends, Tactics, and Optimization, Leveraging Fast Charging Competitor Pricing Data. So, as everyone knows who's been on webinars before, it takes a few minutes for everybody to join. So rather than just sitting here and twiddling our thumbs, we like to have some fun, put it to good use. So we do a little trivia. So our question today is, which of these examples below are not a current charging price? So we have four examples here. One of them, which is what we want you to guess, drop in your guesses in the chat, A, B, C, or D. But we have three that are actual correct and real examples. A Ford dealership in West Virginia charging $3.33 may or may not be true. A Hyundai dealer charging $25 per kilowatt hour from 8 to 7. A Tesla supercharger in Alaska charging 60 cents a kilowatt hour. And a supercharger in Georgia charging 13 cents per kilowatt hour at 4 to 8 a.m. So let us know your guesses on this. We'll have the answer in probably about 10 minutes as we get into the webinar. But which of these do you think is not real that that we actually made up?
Well, we didn't really make it up.
What's that?
It may be based on reality, but
Yeah.
I know when I presented this to you, you gave it a lot of thought. You had a process you went through,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And eventually you got it wrong, right?
Yeah.
So this one's not easy. And unless, of course, you're cheating and looking it up.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, we'll give it a few more seconds here for you to guess, and then we'll go ahead and get started and reveal the answer here, as we said, in a few minutes. So we've got a good quorum so far. So let's go ahead, Bill, and let's kick it off.
Hold on.
Yeah.
My contacts are telling me the chat is disabled.
Well, I enabled it this time. I made sure it was
Okay, I know
enabled.
we made the mistake last time, but
Yeah, but I
okay.
made sure it was enabled this time. I went into the settings, so I don't know, maybe I didn't save it or something. So
right.
anyway, going forward, then if the chat is not working, use the Q&A. So apologies for that. I thought I had it right this time. But leave it to me. I've done probably 350 webinars and still can't get the chat button right. Any rate, I am Lauren McDonald, Chief Analyst at Webinar, and my partner in crime today is?
I am Bill Farrell. I am the co-founder and CTO of Paren. I want to thank you all for joining on our pricing journey today. It's going to take us through some general trends. We'll dive into some specific models and terminology. We'll look at some high-level pricing data views that we have. We'll talk through some strategies, and finally, we'll see some competitive analysis before we finish with your questions on the Q&A, which is open, right? That is open.
Yeah, that'll work.
But before we start, just a little bit of a Paren introduction. Hopefully many of you know Paren by now, but for those who don't, just to refresh, we are building an API-driven access into our large data set of EV charging infrastructure, focused on what we call the 5 pillars of EV charging. There's availability around location and usage. There's reliability, which is an analytical approach to really answer the question, can I charge now? There's pricing, which we're going to talk about today. There's amenities, and then there's safety, which is an algorithmic view of location safety based on several factors. And our customers range from CPOs to automakers to hardware companies and researchers, all who do some really, really interesting things with our data sets. And of course, we have the highly respected Lauren McDonald as our chief analyst. And we leverage what I call his magical abilities to turn data into compelling stories.
All right. Well, thank you for those kind words, Bill. So let's go ahead and kick it off. As Bill mentioned in the opening agenda, we're going to start off by just a few quick trends to kind of set the context for pricing, because we think there's a lot of things that are happening in the industry that are actually going to fuel and drive change and different types of pricing models going forward. So we thought just sort of starting that with that. Set the scene, and the sort of the boxes, if you will, in purple are the ones that we think sort of especially will impact pricing. But some of the general trends that most everybody on today's call are aware of is we're seeing, significant improvement in reliability across the US DC fast charging stations. Our data is sort of tracking that and seeing that. Everybody knows about the sort of the NEVI pause, which is kind of driving what we call sort of, data is the new incentives, right? Incentives are still playing a role, whether it's state, utility, et cetera. But, increasingly what we're saying and what our clients are telling us is that data is becoming much more important over incentives, right? Using that data to pick locations, make business decisions, et cetera. And incentives are becoming sort of more of a nice to have as opposed to a must have. And obviously, there's a lot of fascinating things going on with the hardware players, European companies coming into the market, some companies going away, pulling out of the market after they said they were coming in. And really, there's kind of, what I kind of play as super players. I mean, there's probably about 40 different hardware companies, but of those, sort of about a half a dozen or so actually command probably, 80% of the actual market. And of course, it's still early, but we're seeing sort of the NACS and J3400 adoption, both, at the port level on some of the new EVs coming to market, still very early on that, but also in charging stations and hardware coming out. And then, really what we've seen, and I think, for me and Bill, this was really kind of amazing, right? Just sort of the significant jump in utilization in the last couple of years, and probably particular the last 18 months, a lot of that driven by rideshare drivers adopting EVs in sort of the very sort of urban busy markets, along with just sort of the VIO, right? The number of EVs in operation on the road is starting to sort of stack up, right? And really grow to significant numbers. And we're actually starting to hear some of the CPOs talk about congestion problems. I had a conversation with somebody from one of the major CPOs a few weeks ago that said congestion is starting to become a problem, right? And so what a shift from a couple of years ago when, people were, hoping for more utilization. And then, down at the sort of the bottom level, obviously one of the trends is just, bigger stations. Obviously never requires four, but we're seeing a lot of stations now, 8, 12, 20, et cetera, and higher power, right? Like 350, 400 is becoming a mainstay for a lot of the major players. We're still obviously going to see a lot of 150s, et cetera, but the higher power are, really becoming kind of the standard at a lot of the CPOs. And plug and charge still, again, sort of, I mean, not so much early, but, adoption is still sort of growing there. And obviously that's going to be sort of key to the customer experience. And finally, charging 2.0 players. But before I dive a bit more into that, Bill, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to comment on this.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a different twist on the data over incentives. And you talked about it being a government incentive. So I looked at it a little bit differently. And one of the things is instead of CPOs working with OEMs to give away free charging as an incentive to get drivers to certain stations, we're now seeing use of more data-driven pricing to achieve that goal. And we'll talk about that shortly. I think it was just a different way to kind of spin
Yeah.
the incentives word.
Yep. And so, for those of you that have been sort of, following me and Bill on LinkedIn, et cetera, the charging 2.0 concept is probably not new to you, but it's something I started using a few years ago, really just to sort of explain and capture the trend of a lot of the changes that are happening in the industry of, sort of, again, a lot of things I talked about in the previous slide, sort of the new players, higher power, better, increased focus on customer experience, reliability, et cetera. And obviously the image on the left is a AI image I generated a while back, but we're really moving away from kind of a lot of the model that we saw in the early days of maybe one or two low power 50 kW, less than 100 kW chargers, located out in sort of the parking lot of a restaurant or hotel or coffee shop or strip mall or whatever it is. No lighting, no amenities, anything like that, right? And we're really moving to, you look at a lot of the new players that have come into the market recently, the automakers like Iona and Mercedes-Benz, Rivian, and now players like Walmart coming into the market, and then a lot of the convenience store chains and travel stop companies like Love's and Pilot, and on the convenience store chain, there's Sheetz and Wawa and Quick Stop and 7-Eleven and Circle K, etc. And the reason I bring this up and we talk about this is because of fundamentally, we're going to talk a lot about this going forward, is these companies have a different reason for being in the charging industry, and so how they think about pricing and the type of stations they build can potentially command a more significant price. So, with that, Bill, let's move on to pricing models. So, you know, uh, one of the things that again we're gonna talk about in a minute is just kind of the number of different pricing models and sort of where that's headed, et cetera. But if you think about all those variables and options for CPOs, it sort of makes sense from a business perspective of how do we optimize revenue and margins and utilization, et cetera, by sort of moving the levers and dials around to sort of get that perfect level of price elasticity. But from the consumer side, it just becomes sort of a bit more complicated. And unfortunately, I think it's only going to get sort of more complicated, especially for sort of the newbie buyers and the next wave.
And I think that brings up this concept of pricing transparency, right? And I always take the EV driver's perspective when I'm looking at data trends and policies. And as pricing, I think, becomes more dynamic, EV drivers really will need a visibility, right? They want to be able to see the price of charging without having to rely on apps. I think the EU has a stronger mandate for this based on some rules and regulations than the US does. The US currently has some loose language in the NEVI program, and some state and level funding programs, but it's not necessarily strong right now. And this really leads to situations like you see in the image on the right, right? This receipt shows a customer paying $15 a kilowatt hour. That's not a typo. That's for a 50 plus kilowatt session. That was the off-peak rate. And even PlugShare on some of the sites, it has a warning that this charger charges $200 an hour to charge. And so I'm really hoping that very soon that we start to see pricing signs for EV charging, just like they have in Europe. And I think you mentioned, Lauren, a lot of different convenience stores,
Yeah.
and I envision a day where, as I'm driving down the highway, I'm going to see the big love sign that's 100 feet tall. That's going to have the per kilowatt pricing on it.
Yeah, and Bill, I think that's a really good point, right? We're starting to see this, in Europe. There's probably some stations somewhere in the US that have this kind of signage. I'm not necessarily aware of any, but I think the point that you just made is really important, right? Is with these 2.0 kind of players, right? If you're a Sheetz or Circle K or a Love's or something, you already have probably the digital gas prices out front, and
Right.
so you've got sort of the vehicle and the process and the ability to then add electric prices, whether it's, I don't know, maybe you reprogram them or add new ones and stuff. But yeah, so I think these new players are going to probably adopt this first before like standalone players and that type of thing. But yeah, um, transparency is key. And speaking
And
of transparency, Bill.
And I think that brings us to our trivia answer, right? So the correct answer here is C, highlighted in purple. That's the fake answer. The Tesla supercharger in Chujiak, Alaska, just recently went down to 47 cents per kilowatt hour, not 60. 60-cent prices we typically see reserved for California. And yeah, that $25 an hour option is real. And that's the peak piece we saw in the in the previous slide, that the off-peak hour was $15. We found this one because actually a customer called us up and said, we think there's a typo in your data. And that's how we found it. So shout out to all of those who guessed, at least guessed in their head, see, if not put it into whichever chat feature is available today.
Yeah, Bill, and I think not to pick on auto dealers and stuff, but I think one of the things you and I have seen, and a lot of people on today's webinar have seen this, that the general industry, the major CPO players tend to all use sort of very similar type of pricing, which we'll get into a minute in the different models and stuff. But a lot of the side hosts that it's not their core business, whether it might be, hotel or restaurant or car dealerships, things like that, where they're just not spending the time focused on understanding the industry and the trends and how best to price and optimize for utilization, because it's just, it's not their business.
Not their business.
And in some cases, dealers may have been mandated by the automaker to do it, and so that's why kind of oftentimes you see these sort of outlier prices at places like dealerships and stuff. So speaking of pricing methodologies.
And so before we really get into some of the meat of the discussion, let's talk about just standardize on some terminology, right? When we're talking about our data set, we really talk about fixed and TOU, time of use. And generally folks are familiar with that. And these meet the NEVI program requirements, which are required for charging per kilowatt hour. Dynamic is really a form of TOU where the time isn't specified. It's dynamic based on actual or expected utilization, or maybe some other factors. Time-based pricing, as we see in the two examples just before, is per minute or per hour increments. Flat we use for those that have, say, a one-time fee, and often that fee is free. And there's still a few free chargers out there if you can find them. And the most complicated one, it does not appear frequently in the US. We mostly see it in Canada. We call it power-based pricing. And this is where the price changes throughout the session, depending on how much power the vehicle is drawing. And in that case, you really need to understand your vehicle's charging curves. It's my least favorite as an EV driver because I think you need to know way too much in order to fuel your vehicle. And so, Lauren, I think we want to see, how are these pricing models being used across the US?
Yeah, and I think these are sort of the six major buckets, Bill. And what we also know is that there are some cases where there's combinations of these different pricing points where you'll see, parking fees, a kilowatt hour, right, and then a time or whatever it is. Like there's some really interesting ones, and those are obviously the outliers, but yeah, there's actually more than sort of these six buckets, but they get into sort of really niche areas and stuff. And one that is not really outlined on here is a different variation of the power, which you see a bit, I think, in Europe, not so much here in the US, but could be a trend in the future, is that you might pay more per kilowatt hour if you're charging on a 400 kW charger than a 100 or 150. It remains to be seen if that becomes sort of adopted widely or not. But
Right. We rarely see that today in the US, where
Yeah.
if you've got a mix of 100 kilowatt, 250, 300 kilowatt, 350 kilowatts units at a single location,
Yeah.
we rarely see different pricing models within those subsets.
Yep. So let's look at some sort of example pricing data to kind of help bring some of this to life before we dive into kind of the meat of what we want to talk about today. But um, this is a table from our Q1 2025 State of the Industry report that we think was sort of pretty interesting. In what we did is we looked at the three major buckets of pricing model: fixed, time of use, and time across the states, and then grabbed the top five and bottom five by the fixed column, that first column. And if you scroll down to the bottom, you can see that fixed is still, it's the Pareto principle. It's still the 80-20, right? Still 80%, the vast majority across the states. The stations are using a fixed base price. But California is just sort of off the charts there with leading. It's the only state that's above 50%, right? At 56%. It's probably higher than that now. This was from, a couple of months ago. But the other thing I think is interesting, if you look at Texas, Arizona, and Virginia, right? Each of those three states have, some very large like MSAs in them and stuff, and so they're going to have and large populations of EV drivers. So those states, I think it's sort of indicative of the direction of this is that markets where there's higher than sort of average utilization, you're obviously going to see the CPOs start to adopt, if they don't already, time of use, because in many cases, especially during peak hours of the day, those afternoon hours, they're seeing sometimes, in essence, 80, 100% utilization. They're seeing people queue up. They're seeing rideshare drivers. They're seeing a lot of people all charge at the same time. And so, as Bill and I talked about, you can't grow that business, right? Like if everybody's trying to charge between the same hours. And so the point of time of use and why it's going to, I think, start to grow a lot as utilization grows is using the pricing mechanism to push people into other hours. So the net effect is you have more people charging at more time. And one of the most important things is that typically CPO's margins are much higher at those other hours, because like in the early morning they're paying a lot less for electricity. So it has sort of a double whammy effect of, right, if you can get more people to charge, but also you can get more people to charge when you actually can be more profitable. All right, and this one I thought was kind of a fun slide and chart. So I looked at what the average commercial electricity cost, i.e. tariff, was across the states, and I grabbed it from a site called Power Outage. And so these prices are just sort of, obviously average across multiple utilities in each state. And as far as I know, don't include demand charges. I believe they were just sort of the base charges, right? And average. But and then I took our pricing database, where we averaged across the states the fixed and the time of use rates and compared them. I wanted to understand, just sort of kind of for fun, what is that price differential? What is that sort of typical um, uh, differential between what CPOs are paying for electricity and what they're charging. And again, your mileage may vary. Every CPO might negotiate different rates. They might have a power purchase agreement. They might be impacted differently by demand charges based on utilization. There are a lot of different factors, but so this is just kind of not necessarily reality for any individual CPO, but I thought it was fascinating. Bill, your home state, your former home state of Massachusetts, not at all what I would have expected, having the lowest price differential.
And not really what I would have expected, but now thinking about it a bit more, when I lived there, I lived actually in a co-op utility zone. So we had very cheap prices. We weren't part of whatever the big utility was that serves Boston. But and within Massachusetts, there are a lot of these little co-ops, especially as you get further west into the Berkshire Mountains. They have a lot of wind power. I know we bought power from wind and solar and hydro. And that was a big piece of what we had in our town and how we got our power. So it doesn't surprise me when you start to average all those towns together, you're going to get a lower value. On
Yeah.
the flip side, with Hawaii, I had to double check my numbers, but I think they're somewhere closing in on 40% of all of their power is coming from renewable resources. But they still have to, ship fuel over from mainland to
Yeah.
bring it in, and that costs a lot of money. So that one didn't surprise me as much. Um,
Yeah, yeah, and maybe they're just the high pricing is because there aren't a lot of fast charging stations in Hawaii, so maybe it's sort of a lack of competition and stuff that's driving that. But that differential sort of boggled my mind. But if you look across sort of the last couple of bars there, sort of the mean and median, it's basically on average, again, your mileage may vary, but about a 40 cents differential between commercial electricity rates and what they're actually charging.
so you did your exercise based on this pricing model. I wanted to look at the power of the charger based on the type of pricing model used, right? And when you look at that, not surprisingly, you see time of use, which is the gray color, right? You see that mostly in the lower powered charger. I'm sorry, you see time based in the lower powered chargers, right? Time of use is more heavily used in high power or what we would call travel charging stations. I was a little bit surprised when I saw this chart that it was that fixed pricing is so heavily used in lots of places. So I dug a little bit deeper. I started looking at it sort of from a network perspective. And it's interesting that Electrify America uses fixed pricing for most places outside of California. EVgo uses time of use pretty much everywhere, and they're getting into dynamic pricing. And Tesla is, contrary to some folks I just asked sporadically, is actually everybody thinks all Teslas are time of use. Well, in actuality, 53% of the stations are fixed, 46% are TRU, and there's 1% that are other.
Yeah, yeah,
So,
fascinating. But yeah, go ahead.
yeah, and I was just gonna say, now that we kind of have all this data about the models and this and whatnot, so I think it's time to dig in a bit to the strategies.
Yep, yep. All right, so yeah, let's that was all sort of the trends and background, some example pricing and models and things like that. So let's actually start to now talk about actual sort of pricing strategies and approaches and competitor analysis. So, this slide, you might roll your eyes and say, well, Lauren, that's pretty obvious and stuff. But I think, when I think about what's going to start happening in the industry, as I mentioned earlier, I think there's going to be a lot of testing, a lot of change, a lot of evolution, but I think we're also going to see the industry start to model after a lot of other industries. So, one example is retail, right? Where you might have like, a Nordstrom, a Macy's, and then a Walmart or whatever it is, right? Where you have sort of, or in the airline industry, right? You've got like, maybe a Delta at the top and I'm not sure who would be in the middle, but Southwest or Spirit at the bottom and that type of thing. And so really, I think one of the things we're going to start to see over time is companies have sort of very specific pricing strategies, right? That they're how they want to compete. For example, is as the low price leader, and it's still early. We don't know if Walmart is going to deliver on that, but they've talked about that they're going to bring their sort of retail low price leader model to charging. So we might see them and a few other players really try to grab market share and just really focus primarily on price to drive utilization. On the other side, there's going to be companies that are their business strategy is not necessarily to sell electricity, right? They're really in the charging business, like the automakers, to sell more EVs and to get repeat buyers and to improve the charging customer experience. And convenience store chains and travel centers who want to basically start to migrate into charging revenue as they're seeing their fuel revenue decline, but really drive people into the store to basically spend $5 on a latte where they make a margin of like $3 or $4 or whatever it is, right? And so the point is that these companies, many of them have different business models and strategies, and therefore they may have sort of very different kind of approaches to pricing. So I think we're going to see some of the companies, that CPOs that have very strong brands, whether it's a Mercedes or companies like that, and others, really sort of command that sort of the high end because they believe that their brand, the amenities and things like that can support it. And then there's going to be probably a whole bunch of people in the middle who are primarily competing on location, maybe number of stalls, things like that, but they just want to be sort of price competitive and maybe, find some other ways to sort of differentiate. But really they want to be in sort of the same ballpark on a pricing level.
And then I think we listed, some factors here that we see CPOs and site hosts grappling with when they're setting pricing. I really break these up into three groups. There's sort of the investment group of factors based around hardware, software costs, station size, site leasing, site costs, site leasing costs, if applicable. And then there's a set on the bottom of what I would call marketing factors. There really is your goal. Foot traffic, is it peer pressure? Is it customer retention? These are things you need to think about from a marketing perspective. And then there's the operational costs to consider around energy, competitors, usage patterns. And I think, Lauren, for many of these operators, most all of these are going to come into play.
Yep, yep. And and I mean, I mentioned that the business goals I think is going to key, and ultimately I think, loyalty programs. I know EVgo recently sort of ended their rewards program and stuff, but I think, especially maybe some of the higher end brands, that's sort of the persona, and we might see that, right? And many of the convenience store chains already have loyalty programs, and the challenge for them is to connect their existing apps with their charging apps. With their in-store point of sale system and things like that.
And we've seen, some of our customers in that market looking to do exactly that.
Yeah, yeah. But I think I know this is a bit of an eye chart slide, but I think the point that we really wanted to make here is oftentimes you'll see, people like on LinkedIn and stuff, just talk about it's that this industry is fundamentally about the margin on the power. But I think that's the old model. I think going forward is just going to be, this and other inputs of how we think about designing pricing for stations. And one of the sort of the key points that I wanted to get across, and I know Bill agrees with me on this, is that as we move to this sort of charging 2.0 and these different players that basically step up the game, it's going to increase expectations. But and I believe at least for the next several years, you're going to see this sort of this chasm between a lot of the sort of the older stations and some of the more sort of traditional CPOs who are in it for the business just to sell charging and electricity versus the new players that are in it to drive people in store to sell more EVs and stuff like that. Their charging stations are going to be bigger, more powerful. They're going to have canopies, pull through lanes, clean restrooms, in store. You look at places like the Rove station down in Southern California or the new Iona stations. It's like, it's an entirely sort of new model, along with the travel centers and the convenience store chains have all these amenities and things like that. And my point is, if you're those companies and you're delivering a significantly better experience than the 100K charger in the back of the parking lot station down the street, shouldn't you charge more? can't your experience, can't the customer experience you're providing command a higher price? Now, obviously, you might give up some of the market to the people that are just price shopping, but maybe that's not your customer group, right? Maybe that's not who you're going after, and you're willing to give that to the people down the street.
So with that as a backdrop, we start to look at competitive analysis. All things being equal, does price make a difference? Can it make a difference? How does it work, right? So what happens all of a sudden when you have competition? If you're not from the Southeast, then you may not have heard of Buc-ee's, right? It's a giant convenience store, gas station, home goods, beef jerky store. If you've been there, you know what I mean. Typically,
Giant is an understatement, I think, Bill.
yes. But typically 100 plus gas pumps. And they typically have at least one EV charging station. Most of the times they have two. And this is the one site that I could find that actually has three CPOs in the parking lot. There's a 16 stall Tesla V3 supercharger that's open to all cars. There's a 4-port Electrify America up to 350 kW. And then there's a 10-port Mercedes-Benz site, which uses the ChargePoint hardware, which has peak speeds of up to 400. So we took a look at some possible pricing questions that CPOs should be asking. And for all three, there's a question about how to attract the non-Tesla vehicles, right? It's clear that Mercedes-Benz pricing was sort of wrong out of the gate at 51 cents and was adjusted significantly in March to match and beat the competition. Most recently, it was lowered again to 33 cents versus Electrify America's standard rate of 36 cents across the board as a fixed price. And it's also clear that Tesla is not currently interested in competing for price-sensitive customers at that middle line, not in the middle there at 43 cents. That's for the non-Tesla drivers. I'm sure they get their fair share of the available market just based on their name and perceived reliability versus the competition. But on the flip side, then look at 33 cents, is it possible that Mercedes-Benz is going after some of that Tesla traffic, right? Some of that Tesla native traffic that is interested in and has a vehicle that can support faster charging that they may not be able to get at that supercharger. We see Tesla has a slightly downward move recently, and that could be a response to that threat. We also see that in early June, Mercedes-Benz had another downward change. So this is really an example of a growing trend that we see around pricing intelligence. And so if you replace this parking lot, for example, in the middle of nowhere, with a mall parking lot with CPOs on either side, or with a busy road off of a highway intersection where you might have multiple choices, you have the same thing. Pricing matters. You need to know your competitor's behavior. In the end, I think consumers benefit from this type of behavior. But I think we're going to be seeing more and more of this. Lauren, your
Yeah,
thought?
Bill, I think this is sort of fascinating and to me surprising. I sort of did this all set up about brands like Mercedes-Benz commanding the high end, and here they are, clearly learning and dropping. And I think, sort of the one of the lessons and takeaway here is that, we're moving to this term that's being used in the industry of station-based pricing, right? Where even though, it seems Electrify America has pretty much the same price across the country. I think we don't think that that's going to be the strategy that most companies do, that there's going to be sort of very different pricing based on, all those different factors we talked about, but especially and including sort of the competitor factors, not just pricing, but just, power and amenities and things like that. But this is one where, the amenities is Buc-ee's. And so you're really just sort of competing on sort of, the reliability and the power level and throughput and things like that. And so it's sort of fascinating. But I bet these three same players, or at least two of them, if they're a station somewhere else by themselves, would have a very different approach to pricing. And maybe Mercedes is like, significantly higher or whatever it is. The point is that it's going to be complicated. It's going to be different. It's going to be market and competitor based.
It's just another factor
Yeah,
to put in,
yeah,
right, as we
yeah,
discussed earlier.
yeah, yeah.
So let's change
Just
tactics a bit and let's
yeah,
look at pricing. I'll say from a money making perspective, from a CPO perspective, right? We know that dynamic pricing is getting launched by some CPOs. It's been out for a while. Tesla recently announced a pilot for 10 sites in California. They're all V3 Tesla only sites, which I'm sure was done on purpose. We picked the Sacramento site to watch the trends at this supercharger location. And what we see are, I think, are a set of experiments on different ways, on different days rather, to across a 3-week study timeframe that we had. So there's 3 prices that we've labeled sort of a base or off-peak price at 34 cents. There's a peak price at 45 cents, and then there's what I call a super peak price at 54 cents, which based on the peaks here is only used for short durations. If you look at the top graph here, the one of the week of May 11th, it looks to be like there was one experiment midweek. We know that generally charging utilization peaks on the weekends and it valleys in that Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday period. So I'm not quite sure what this experiment was trying to accomplish, unless it was trying to drive away rideshare drivers with no, no off-peak pricing for those 3 days. I doubt that they were going to attract any rideshare drivers. If they were, they're going to certainly make more money. For the following weeks, we don't really see any other of those types of experiments being run. But if you look at the bottom of the graph, the week of May 25th, Monday, May 26th was the holiday. That's a unique day compared with the other Mondays if you look straight up. So more time was spent, I think, at that super peak charging rate, which would correspond to increased traffic, which would correspond to higher revenue for that day. So using dynamic pricing, I think, in this way is really an excellent way to increase revenue. But the flip side is it makes it very difficult, I think, for the consumer to understand the best price. So when you go back to one of the earlier slides about charging transparency, I know when I go on a road trip and I leave my house, I have a full tank, right? So I've got about 2.5 hours of driving before I have to stop. If I target this station as part of my stop, what price will it be? How will I know? Right. So I think one of the downsides here is this pricing differential of 20 cents could be the difference of $12 in my charging session. Right. So if I'm pulling 60 kilowatts, I just picked that number. Right.
yeah.
So Lawrence, I just wanted Lauren, I wanted
Yeah.
to get your thoughts on this charging approach.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating, Bill, in that, it sort of brings to life what a couple of things we've been talking about, right? That we're still early and that companies are testing and trying different things out, and it looks like it's very clear that Tesla tried some things and then learned some things, and then, now we're moving to, I think, not only, dynamic pricing, but obviously and time of day. But I think, sort of the next thing we're seeing is, or excuse me, we're moving to day of week, right? That
Right.
sort of the next phase of TOU and dynamic pricing is looking at different days, right? Is you've written and talked about a lot, Bill. There are certain days like, Friday and Saturday, which just have significantly higher utilization. So using the model that the airlines and stuff in hotels use, not surprising, that you could charge more for that because it's supply and demand, right?
Right.
Again, to
Exactly.
your point, it's maybe it makes it more complicated for consumers, but this is a business after all, right? And so at any rate, I think, yeah, we're going to see continue to see a lot more of this going forward. So, and sort of our last sort of, trying to bring this all together and think about, okay, this was a lot. How do we sort of make sense of it? What's sort of like a framework to think about, designing your pricing and inputs and stuff. I think it all starts with both, your companies, your CPOs and specific sites, business goals, as well as those of the stations nearby that you're competing with, right? As I mentioned earlier, the station down the street might be like a regional CPO or something that's just selling power, right? Or or it might be, Mercedes or Iona or Walmart, or somebody that's in it for sort of different reasons. And so you need to understand what might be going into how they're thinking about pricing, and then how your goals sort of match up to that, and sort of, are you competing on sort of on different business goals, right?
Right.
And how you think about that, which leads to, the station itself, right? Again, not to sort of beat a dead horse on this, but is your station a 12 stall 400 kW with, a restaurant and amenities and things like that, and the one down the street is, two stall, 100 kWs or whatever, right? Can you, you're delivering a significantly better charging experience, not just electricity. Can you command more for that? And then the input obviously is what it costs, right? Those two stations I just described, one might cost $150,000 to build, and the other 1.5 million, right? And so, that your costs and payback period are a factor. Again, as we talked about, what type of pricing model are your competitors using? And I think a key one really, Bill, is utilization, and that's data that we provide our customers, because if your utilization is low or it's high, you might use some type of price elasticity, right, to actually, increase either utilization, right, or to increase profits.
Based on competition,
Yeah.
right? So why is the charger across the street getting more traffic than I am, right?
Yeah.
And what can I do to raise that, or vice versa? What am I doing better that I might want to bring to my other locations,
Yeah.
and how do I maintain that, right? And I think that test box in the corner there is,
Yeah.
it is not a one and done thing. It's something that continuously has to be monitored and accounted for as VIO increases, as
Yeah.
more stations become available.
Yep, yep. And obviously we've talked a lot about this brand reputation, and then, as I mentioned, price elasticity, right? And in sort of merging those last two box testing, I think we're going to see, as we've said, a lot of testing to see the impact of pricing on utilization and revenue and margins. And so, price elasticity and demand elasticity becomes sort of a key part of your sort of, algorithm of how you're thinking about pricing. Is like, if I'm going to increase pricing X percent, it should deliver a commensurate increase in utilization and revenue. And if not, right, then you've got to adjust it, and vice versa. So.
If you are interested in some of the data analysis that we provided, we'd be happy to give you a demo and talk about how this can help in your business planning and execution. So just reach out to us, either find one of us on LinkedIn, always open to chatting there, or just send us a message at hello@paren.app.